Hey guys, tonight we begin with a name that echoes through history like thunder across marble halls. Julius Caesar. The man, the myth, the legend who crossed the Rubicon and changed the world forever. But here's the thing, everyone gets wrong about Caesar. His life wasn't some grand adventure filled with glory and triumph. It was actually a nightmare wrapped in a toga, drenched in paranoia, and seasoned with betrayal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. You've conquered Gaul, you've defeated your enemies, and you rule an empire that stretches from Britain to Egypt. Sounds pretty good, right? Wrong. Because being Julius Caesar meant living every single day, knowing that literally everyone around you wanted you dead. Your friends, your allies, your own family members. They were all plotting, scheming, and sharpening their knives behind those friendly smiles and respectful bows. Let's start with the obvious problem. Politics in ancient Rome wasn't like modern democracy, where you debate policies and shake hands afterward. Roman politics was a blood sport played with real blood. Every decision you made created enemies. Every law you passed threatened someone's wealth or power. Every victory on the battlefield made rivals back home more desperate to destroy you. And Caesar? He was really, really good at making enemies. From the moment he stepped into the political arena, Caesar was swimming with sharks. The Roman Republic was run by the Senate, a collection of wealthy aristocrats who treated politics like their personal playground. These weren't public servants dedicated to the common good. They were power-hungry elites who saw Caesar as a dangerous upstart, threatening their comfortable little world of corruption and backroom deals. Caesar's first major mistake was being too successful too quickly. He formed the first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus, essentially creating an illegal shadow government that bypassed the Senate entirely. Smart move politically, but it painted a target on his back the size of the Colosseum. The senators didn't just dislike him now, they actively feared him, and in Rome, fear quickly turned into assassination plots. But here's where it gets really twisted. Caesar knew they wanted him dead. He wasn't naive about the threats swirling around him like vultures over a battlefield. Yet he had to keep playing the game, keep smiling at dinner parties, keep making alliances with people he knew were probably planning his murder. Imagine going to work every day knowing your co-workers are discussing the best way to stab you in the back. Literally. The paranoia must have been absolutely crushing. Every meal could be poisoned. Every friendly conversation might be gathering intelligence for future betrayal. Every invitation to a meeting could be a trap. Caesar lived in a world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but isolation meant political death. He had to stay engaged, stay visible, stay vulnerable. And let's talk about his so-called friends. Brutus, the man Caesar supposedly loved like a son, was secretly meeting with conspirators and planning the most famous assassination in history. Marcus Brutus wasn't some random enemy or political rival. This was someone Caesar had mentored, protected, and treated as family. Imagine discovering that your closest confidant, someone you've helped and supported for years, is actively working to destroy you. The betrayal wasn't just political. It was deeply personal. Then there's the burden of constant warfare. Everyone remembers Caesar's military genius, his brilliant tactical victories, his conquest of Gaul. What they don't talk about is the psychological toll of spending years in the field, watching men die under your command, making life and death decisions that affected entire civilizations. Caesar wasn't just a politician playing games in Rome. He was a military commander responsible for the lives of thousands of soldiers and the fate of entire peoples. The Gallic Wars weren't some glorious adventure. They were brutal, bloody campaigns that lasted nearly a decade. Caesar witnessed horrific battles, ordered mass executions, and participated in siege warfare that left cities in ruins and populations decimated. He carried the weight of those decisions, those deaths, those destroyed lives. And for what? Political advancement back in Rome, where people who had never held a sword were plotting his destruction. But Caesar couldn't show weakness. He couldn't admit to the sleepless nights, the guilt, the crushing responsibility. Roman culture demanded that leaders project strength and confidence at all times. Any sign of vulnerability would be seized upon by enemies and used as a weapon. So Caesar had to maintain this facade of invincibility while internally dealing with the trauma of command and the constant threat of betrayal. The financial pressure was another nightmare most people never consider. Roman politics required enormous wealth to maintain your position. You had to fund public games, sponsor building projects, provide gifts to supporters, and maintain a lifestyle that projected power and success. Caesar was constantly in debt, borrowing massive sums to finance his political career and military campaigns. The stress of managing these debts while fighting wars and dodging assassins would have broken most men. And here's the cruel irony. The more successful Caesar became, the more dangerous his position grew. Every victory in Gaul made the Senate more afraid of his power. Every triumph celebrated in Rome reminded his enemies that he was becoming too popular with the common people. Success wasn't protecting him. It was sealing his fate. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra is often romanticized in movies and literature, but the reality was far more complicated. This wasn't some passionate love affair between equals. It was a strategic alliance fraught with political implications that created even more enemies back in Rome. The senators already viewed Caesar with suspicion, and his relationship with a foreign queen only confirmed their worst fears about his ambitions. Think about the impossible position this created. Caesar needed Cleopatra's support and Egypt's wealth to maintain his power, but every moment spent with her was ammunition for his enemies. They painted him as someone who had abandoned Roman values, who was more interested in playing Pharaoh than serving the Republic. The relationship that might have provided some personal happiness became another source of political vulnerability. The crossing of the Rubicon, that famous moment when Caesar committed to civil war, wasn't some bold declaration of destiny. It was the desperate act of a man who realized he was out of options. Caesar knew that returning to Rome as a private citizen meant facing prosecution, exile, or death. His enemies had made it clear that they would destroy him the moment he lost his legal immunity as a provincial governor. So he gambled everything on civil war, knowing that victory would make him a dictator and defeat would mean his complete destruction. But even after winning the civil war and becoming dictator, Caesar's problems only got worse. Now, he wasn't just dealing with political enemies, he was trying to govern a republic that had never been designed for one-man rule. Every decision he made set precedents that could either strengthen or destroy the Roman system of government. The weight of essentially creating a new form of government while maintaining the fiction of republican traditions was staggering. Caesar had to balance competing interests that were fundamentally incompatible. The common people loved him because he provided entertainment, debt relief, and military victories. The aristocrats hated him because he threatened their traditional privileges. The military supported him because he paid them well and led them to glory. The Senate opposed him because he had effectively made them irrelevant. There was no way to satisfy all these groups simultaneously. And through all of this political maneuvering, Caesar was getting older. He suffered from what might have been epilepsy, experiencing seizures that he had to hide from public view. Any sign of physical weakness would have been seized upon by enemies as proof that the gods had abandoned him or that he was unfit to rule. So Caesar had to project strength and vitality while privately dealing with a chronic medical condition that could strike at any moment. The loneliness must have been overwhelming. When you're at the pinnacle of power, surrounded by people who want something from you or want to destroy you, genuine human connection becomes almost impossible. Every friend might be a spy. Every ally might be a future enemy. Every conversation might be a trap. Caesar lived in a gilded cage of his own making, powerful beyond measure, but isolated in ways that would drive most people insane. The worst part wasn't even the enemies he could see. It was the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing the masks of friendship while sharpening their daggers in the shadows. Roman society was built on networks of patronage and obligation, which sounds civilized, until you realize it meant Caesar was trapped in a web of relationships where loyalty was always conditional and betrayal was always profitable. Take his relationship with the Senate. Caesar needed their approval to legitimize his actions, but every time he asked for their support, he was essentially begging the very people who wanted him dead to please not kill him today. Imagine walking into a room full of people you know despise you, people who have already decided you need to die, and having to smile and negotiate as if you're all reasonable colleagues working toward common goals. The Senate meetings were psychological torture sessions disguised as political discourse. Caesar would sit there listening to senators give speeches about the glory of the Republic and the importance of tradition, knowing full well they were really talking about how much they wanted him gone. Every procedural delay was a small act of defiance. Every lengthy debate was a passive-aggressive attack on his authority. They couldn't stab him in the chamber, so they death by 1,000 cuts through bureaucratic warfare. But Caesar couldn't just ignore the Senate or rule through pure military force. That would have made him a tyrant in the eyes of the Roman people, destroying the very legitimacy he needed to maintain power. So he had to play along with the charade, pretending to respect institutions that had already declared war on him. It was like being forced to have dinner with your executioner every night while making small talk about the weather. The religious obligations made everything worse. As Pontifex Maximus, Caesar was responsible for maintaining Rome's relationship with the gods. This meant performing countless rituals, ceremonies, and sacrifices, all while dealing with priests who were also politicians and therefore potential enemies. He couldn't even pray without wondering if the person next to him was planning his assassination. Roman religion was deeply intertwined with politics, so every religious ceremony became a political statement. If Caesar changed a ritual, his enemies would claim he was offending the gods. If he followed tradition exactly, they would find some other reason to criticize him. The gods themselves seemed to be taking sides in political disputes, or at least that's what every ambitious senator claimed when they interpreted omens in ways that supported their particular agenda. And speaking of omens, Caesar lived in a world where people believed the future could be read in the flight patterns of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, and the behavior of sacred chickens. Imagine trying to run an empire while constantly being told that the gods are angry about your breakfast choices, or that a flock of geese flying south means you shouldn't invade Britannia today. The soothsayers and augurs weren't just religious figures, they were political players who could influence public opinion by claiming divine disapproval of Caesar's policies. Every prophecy was potentially a weapon aimed at his legitimacy. Every warning about bad omens was possibly a coordinated attack on his authority. Caesar had to navigate not just human politics, but divine politics, never knowing which priest was genuinely interpreting the will of the gods and which one was getting paid by his enemies. The famous warning to "beware the Ides of March" wasn't just some mysterious prophecy, it was psychological warfare. Someone wanted Caesar to know that his death had been planned, scheduled, and approved by fate itself. Living with that knowledge, knowing the exact date of your prophesied doom, must have been like carrying a countdown timer to your own execution. Caesar's family life was another source of constant stress rather than comfort. His daughter Julia died young, taking with her not just personal happiness, but also a crucial political alliance through her marriage to Pompey. In Rome, family members were political assets first, and loved ones second. Every marriage was a treaty, every child a potential hostage to fortune, every relative a possible source of scandal or weakness. His various marriages were diplomatic arrangements designed to strengthen his political position, but they also created new vulnerabilities. Each wife brought her own family connections, which meant new allies, but also new people who might turn against him. His relationship with Cleopatra produced a son who could have been either his greatest legacy or his most dangerous liability, depending on how Roman politics played out after his death. The constant travel required by his position was exhausting in ways modern people can barely comprehend. Caesar spent years moving between military camps, provincial capitals, and Rome itself, always accompanied by massive entourages that required feeding, housing, and protecting. Every journey was a logistical nightmare and a security risk. Bandits, hostile tribes, political enemies, and simple accidents could end his life at any moment. Ancient transportation was slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous. Caesar travelled in a world without maps as we know them, where roads were often little more than muddy tracks, where bridges collapsed regularly, and where crossing rivers could turn into military operations. He spent countless hours bouncing around in primitive carriages or riding horses across terrain that would challenge modern all-terrain vehicles. The communication delays made everything worse. Messages between Rome and distant provinces took weeks or months to deliver, assuming they arrived at all. Caesar would make decisions based on information that was already obsolete by the time he received it. Meanwhile, his enemies back in Rome were spinning events, spreading rumours and building opposition based on their own incomplete understanding of what Caesar was actually doing hundreds of miles away. This communication lag created a constant state of uncertainty. Caesar never knew what crisis might be brewing in Rome while he was fighting in Gaul, and the Romans never knew whether Caesar was winning glorious victories or suffering catastrophic defeats until long after the fact. Rumours filled the information vacuum, and Caesar's enemies were always ready to spread the worst possible interpretations of ambiguous news. The administrative burden of running an expanding empire was staggering. Caesar wasn't just a military commander and political leader, he was essentially the CEO of the largest corporation in the ancient world, responsible for tax collection, infrastructure projects, trade regulation, legal disputes, and military logistics across dozens of provinces and hundreds of cities. Every provincial governor was a potential rebel, every tax collector a possible embezzler, every military commander a future rival. Caesar had to manage all of these people while they were scattered across thousands of miles of territory, communicating through messengers who might be bribed, killed, or simply lost along the way. Modern executives complain about managing global corporations with instant communication, satellite phones, and video conferencing. Caesar was doing it with smoke signals and guys on horses. The legal system added another layer of complexity to his daily nightmare. Roman law was incredibly sophisticated, but also incredibly complex. And as dictator, Caesar was expected to be final arbiter of legal disputes. This meant spending hours listening to lawyers argue about property disputes, inheritance claims, and contractual obligations, while also trying to run military campaigns and manage political crises. Every legal decision was also a political decision. Ruling in favour of one party meant making an enemy of the other, and both parties probably had powerful friends who would remember the verdict when it came time to choose sides in future conflicts. Caesar couldn't just apply the law objectively. He had to consider the political ramifications of every ruling, the family connections of every litigant, and the broader implications of every precedent he set. The economic pressures were relentless. Rome's economy depended on conquest and tribute, which meant Caesar constantly had to balance the costs of military campaigns against the wealth they generated. Every war was essentially a business investment that had to pay for itself through plunder, tribute, and new territory. Failure to generate sufficient returns would lead to financial crisis, political opposition, and probably civil war. Managing the Roman treasury was like trying to balance a budget where half the income came from robbing banks and the other half came from protection money. Caesar had to fund massive public works projects, maintain multiple armies, subsidize grain distributions to keep the urban poor happy, and still have enough left over to bribe senators and reward loyal supporters. The corruption was endemic and unavoidable. Everyone expected to profit from their association with power, and Caesar had to decide who to pay off, how much to pay them, and when to cut them off before they became too expensive or too dangerous. Every gift created an obligation. Every favour generated an expectation of future rewards. Caesar was trapped in an endless cycle of political bribery that consumed enormous resources while never actually securing lasting loyalty. Even his legendary charisma became a burden. The Roman people expected Caesar to be charming, witty, and personally engaging with everyone from senators to common soldiers. He couldn't have an off day, couldn't be tired or sick, or simply not in the mood to perform. Every public appearance was a theatrical performance where showing weakness or irritability could damage his reputation and encourage his enemies. The physical demands were crushing. Caesar spent decades wearing heavy armour, riding horses for hours, and sleeping on the ground in military camps. He fought in battles personally, not from some safe command position, which meant risking death or crippling injury every time his army engaged the enemy. The accumulated wear and tear on his body must have been enormous, but he couldn't afford to show pain or acknowledge limitations. And then there was the constant pressure to be perfect. Roman culture worshipped military genius and political brilliance, but it also demanded that its heroes never stumble, never doubt, never show the slightest crack in their armour of invincibility. Caesar had to be the greatest general who ever lived, the most skilled politician in history, and the most charismatic leader Rome had ever seen. All at the same time. All the time. There was no room for human weakness. The weight of legacy haunted every decision. Caesar wasn't just ruling for today or tomorrow. Every choice he made would echo through history, affecting generations of Romans who weren't even born yet. The pressure to make the right decision when you know that wrong choices could destroy an entire civilization is the kind of stress that breaks minds and souls. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of Caesar's life was the knowledge that no matter what he achieved, no matter how many battles he won, or how many enemies he defeated, the end was already written. The Ides of March weren't just a date on the calendar. They were destiny approaching with mathematical precision. Caesar knew he was living on borrowed time, that every sunrise might be his last, that every friend might be the one to finally drive a dagger into his heart. The conspirators weren't content to simply kill him. They wanted to destroy everything he represented, everything he had built, everything he had tried to accomplish. The assassination wasn't just murder, it was the systematic erasure of a man's life's work, carried out by people who had smiled at him across dinner tables and voted with him in the Senate. Living with the knowledge of your own prophesied death while trying to maintain the facade of invincible leadership must have been psychological torture. Every morning, Caesar woke up knowing that today might be the day. Every meeting might be his last. Every handshake might come from fingers that would soon be wrapped around a blade aimed at his chest. The irony is suffocating. Caesar conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, crossed the Rubicon, and transformed the Roman world. But he couldn't conquer the one enemy that mattered most, the fear and hatred of the very people he was trying to serve. All his military genius, all his political cunning, all his legendary charisma couldn't protect him from the simple human reality that power makes you a target. And the final insult. Even in death, Caesar couldn't escape. His assassination unleashed a civil war that destroyed the republic he had tried to save and ushered in the empire he had tried to avoid. The conspirators who killed him thinking they were preserving Roman freedom instead created the conditions for Augustus to become the first emperor. Caesar's death accomplished the exact opposite of what everyone involved actually wanted. The man who changed the world forever was ultimately powerless to change his own fate. That's not glory. That's tragedy on a cosmic scale. But the psychological torment went even deeper than the threat of assassination. Caesar had to live with the knowledge that he was fundamentally alone in ways that ordinary people could never understand. When you're the most powerful person in the world, you can't have real friends. You can only have allies, enemies, and people waiting to see which category offers better opportunities. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every meal was a diplomatic summit. Every moment of apparent relaxation was actually an opportunity for others to study you, to find weaknesses, to gather intelligence that might be useful later. Caesar couldn't let his guard down because the moment he showed genuine emotion or revealed authentic thoughts, someone would weaponize that information against him. The burden of decision-making was inhuman. Every choice Caesar made affected millions of lives. A decision to march his army east instead of west could determine whether thousands of soldiers lived or died, whether entire cities prospered or burned, whether civilizations survived or vanished. The weight of that responsibility would crush most people. But Caesar had to carry it while also projecting the confidence and certainty that leadership demanded. Modern leaders at least have advisors, experts, and institutional knowledge to help guide their decisions. Caesar was operating in uncharted territory, making choices that had never been made before, setting precedents that would shape human history. He couldn't look up the right answer in a book or consult with someone who had faced similar challenges. He was writing the playbook as he went along, knowing that future generations would judge every word. The religious obligations created another layer of impossible pressure. As Pontifex Maximus, Caesar was responsible for maintaining Rome's relationship with the gods, but he was also expected to use religion as a political tool. He had to appear genuinely devout while simultaneously manipulating religious ceremonies for political advantage. The cognitive dissonance of being both a true believer and a cynical manipulator must have been psychologically devastating. Roman religion wasn't like modern faith, where you can have a personal relationship with the divine. Roman gods were transactional entities who demanded precise rituals, exact sacrifices, and perfect adherence to ancient traditions. A single mistake in a ceremony could invalidate the entire ritual and require starting over. Caesar had to memorize countless prayers, perform hundreds of different sacrifices, and maintain ritual purity while also leading armies and governing provinces. The gods were also notoriously fickle and easily offended. Every military defeat, every natural disaster, every unfortunate coincidence was potentially a sign of divine displeasure with Caesar's leadership. His enemies were always ready to interpret any misfortune as proof that the gods had abandoned him. Caesar lived in constant fear that some random event completely outside his control would be used as evidence that he had lost divine favour. The administrative nightmare of governing Rome was like trying to manage a corporation where every employee was plotting a hostile takeover. Caesar had to delegate authority to provincial governors, military commanders, and civic officials, but he also had to assume that many of these people were corrupt, incompetent, or actively disloyal. Every person he trusted with power was a potential future enemy who might use that power against him. The communication delays meant Caesar was always operating with incomplete information. By the time he learned about a crisis in one province, 3 other provinces might have erupted into rebellion. He was playing a game of chess where he could only see half the board and his opponents could move pieces while he wasn't looking. The stress of trying to maintain control over such a vast and chaotic system must have been overwhelming. The financial pressures were relentless and contradictory. Caesar needed enormous amounts of money to maintain his political position, fund his armies, and complete the public works projects that kept the Roman people happy. But the traditional sources of wealth, conquest, tribute, and taxation were also the activities that made his enemies more determined to destroy him. Every successful campaign that filled the treasury also increased the number of people who wanted him dead. Roman politics required constant bribery, disguised as gifts, favors, and patronage. Caesar had to maintain expensive relationships with hundreds of senators, governors, generals, and civic leaders, never knowing which investments would pay off and which would simply fund future assassination attempts. The social obligations alone must have consumed enormous amounts of time and energy that he desperately needed for actual governance. The worst part was the knowledge that all this effort was ultimately futile. Caesar could see the structural problems destroying the Roman Republic, but he was trapped within a system that made real reform impossible. Every attempt to fix fundamental issues created new enemies and new crises. He was like a doctor trying to perform surgery on himself, while the patient fought back and other doctors tried to sabotage the operation. The Senate wasn't just politically opposed to Caesar. They represented a fundamental incompatibility between the old Roman system of shared aristocratic power and the new reality of governing a world empire. Caesar understood that Rome needed stronger central authority to function effectively, but implementing that authority meant destroying the very people whose support he needed to maintain legitimacy. The tragic irony was that Caesar's enemies were right to fear him, but they were wrong about what he represented. They saw him as a tyrant who wanted to destroy Roman freedom, when in reality he was trying to save Roman civilization from its own internal contradictions. Their successful assassination didn't preserve the Republic. It guaranteed its destruction and ushered in centuries of imperial rule that was far more autocratic than anything Caesar had actually planned. Caesar's personal relationships were poisoned by the impossibility of separating private affection from political calculation. Every friendship was potentially a strategic alliance. Every romantic relationship carried diplomatic implications. Every family connection could become a vulnerability that enemies might exploit. He couldn't love anyone without wondering whether that was love genuine or whether it was being. The constant performed for political advantage, his life sleeping in UNF Caesar spent years of travel required by his position, familiar beds, eating unfamiliar food, and dealing with unfamiliar dangers. He was essentially homeless, moving from military camp to provincial capital to Rome itself in an endless cycle of obligation and responsibility. He never had a place where he could truly relax, truly be himself, truly escape from the crushing weight of being Julius Caesar. Even his legendary military successes created new problems. Every victory in Gaul made the senators more afraid of his growing power and popularity. Every triumph celebrated in Rome reminded his enemies that he commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions. His achievements became the evidence his enemies used to justify their determination to destroy him. The Gallic Wars weren't just military campaigns. They were 8 years of constant warfare, political maneuvering, and psychological pressure. Caesar had to maintain the loyalty of his troops while also managing the complex politics of dozens of Gallic tribes, many of whom were playing their own games of alliance and betrayal. Every battle won created new enemies among the defeated and new expectations among his supporters. The logistics of maintaining armies in hostile territory were staggering. Caesar had to ensure that his legions were fed, equipped and paid while operating hundreds of miles from their supply bases. Every decision about where to march, where to make camp, and where to fight had life or death consequences for thousands of men who trusted him with their lives. But the psychological toll went beyond the stress of command. Caesar had to order actions that violated his own moral principles because military siege necessity demanded it. The Avalicia involved starving an entire city into submission. The conquest of Gaul required the systematic destruction of cultures that had existed for centuries. Caesar carried the weight of these decisions, knowing that history would judge him for every life lost and every civilization destroyed. The relationship with his soldiers was another source of constant pressure. The legions loved Caesar because he shared their dangers, rewarded their loyalty, and led them to victory after victory. But this loyalty was conditional and potentially dangerous. If Caesar ever failed to meet their expectations for pay, plunder, and glory, the same soldiers who cheered his name might turn against him. Roman military culture was built on personal relationships between commanders and their troops, which meant Caesar's authority depended on maintaining the affection and respect of thousands of individual soldiers. He had to remember names, acknowledge personal achievements, and demonstrate genuine concern for their welfare, while also asking them to march into situations where many of them would die. The burden of command meant that every tactical mistake Caesar made was paid for in blood by men who trusted him. Every miscalculation resulted in Roman soldiers dying far from home in service to his ambitions. The guilt of sending good men to their deaths for political advantage must have been crushing, but Caesar couldn't show that guilt without appearing weak and undermining the confidence his troops needed to fight effectively. And through all of this military, political, and personal nightmare, Caesar still had to maintain the public persona of the confident, charismatic leader that Roman culture demanded. He couldn't have bad days. He couldn't show fear or doubt or exhaustion. He couldn't admit that the weight of responsibility was slowly destroying him from the inside. The final cruel irony is that Caesar's assassination was carried out by people who claimed to be saving Rome from tyranny, but their actions guaranteed that Rome would be ruled by actual tyrants for the next 5 centuries. They killed the one man who might have been able to reform the Republic and preserve some version of Roman freedom, and in doing so, they ensured that freedom would be completely extinguished. Julius Caesar didn't die as a tyrant. He died as a man head by the impossible crews who had been contradictions of trying to save a system that was determined to destroy itself. And the worst part? He probably saw it coming. The physical deterioration was another daily torment that Caesar couldn't escape. Those seizures that historians politely call the falling sickness weren't just medical episodes. They were moments of complete vulnerability in a world where showing weakness meant death. Imagine trying to maintain absolute authority while knowing that at any moment, without warning, you might collapse in front of your enemies, convulsing and helpless. Caesar had to structure his entire life around hiding this condition. Every public appearance was a calculated risk. Every Senate meeting could become a rival's would interpret medical emergency that his punishment or proof as divine of unfitness to rule. He couldn't seek proper medical treatment because admitting the severity of his condition would have been political suicide. The ancient world had no understanding of epilepsy as a neurological disorder. To Romans, seizures were either divine possession or demonic influence, neither of which was particularly helpful for a leader trying to maintain credibility. Caesar lived with the constant fear that his next episode might happen in front of the wrong people at the worst possible moment. The medication available was primitive and unreliable. Roman physicians prescribed everything from drinking gladiator blood to wearing amulets made from various animal parts. None of it worked, which meant Caesar was essentially managing a serious chronic illness with nothing but willpower and careful scheduling. The stress of hiding his condition probably made the seizures worse, creating a vicious cycle of medical and political pressure. But the seizures were just the visible symptom of deeper physical breakdown. Years of campaigning in harsh conditions, sleeping on the ground, wearing heavy armor, and enduring the constant stress of command had taken a devastating toll on his body. Caesar was aging rapidly, developing the kinds of health problems that modern executives get from high-stress careers, except his stress levels were literally life and death every single day. The dietary restrictions were another hidden torment. Roman feasts were elaborate social and political events where refusing food could be interpreted as an insult or a sign of weakness. But Caesar had to be constantly vigilant about poison, which meant he could never truly enjoy a meal. Every bite was a risk assessment. Every drink required careful consideration of who had prepared it and who had access to it. The paranoia about food extended to every aspect of daily life. Caesar couldn't eat street food, couldn't accept hospitality from potential allies, couldn't even trust his own kitchen staff completely. He was essentially under self-imposed house arrest when it came to basic human needs, like eating and drinking. The simple pleasure of sharing a meal with friends was corrupted by the constant awareness that the person passing you the wine might be passing you your death sentence. Sleep was another battlefield. Caesar couldn't afford to be truly unconscious and vulnerable for extended periods. He had to train himself to sleep lightly, to wake instantly at any unusual sound, to be ready to defend himself or escape at a moment's notice. The chronic sleep deprivation must have been devastating to both his physical health and his mental acuity. Even his living arrangements were a constant reminder of his precarious position. Caesar couldn't live in a normal house with normal security. Every room had to be checked for hidden passages. Every window was a potential entry point for assassins. Every servant was a possible spy. His home wasn't a refuge from the pressures of leadership. It was another fortification in an ongoing war. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest torture of all. Caesar was surrounded by people constantly, but he couldn't trust any of them completely. Every conversation was potentially being recorded by someone with their own agenda. Every moment of apparent friendship might be a performance designed to gather intelligence or gain advantage. The loneliness of absolute power meant that Caesar couldn't have the kind of genuine human connections that make life bearable. He couldn't complain about his problems because that would show weakness. He couldn't ask for help because that would create debt and obligation. He couldn't even express authentic emotions because everything he said might be used against him later. The burden of being a living legend was psychologically crushing. Roman culture had elevated Caesar to mythical status while he was still alive, which meant he had to live up to impossible expectations every single day. He wasn't allowed to be human. He had to be Caesar, the perfect general, the brilliant politician, the charismatic leader who never made mistakes and never showed doubt. This mythologization created a prison of public expectation. Every decision Caesar made was compared to his previous achievements. Every speech had to be better than his last one. Every military campaign had to be more spectacular than the one before. He was trapped in an endless cycle of escalating expectations that could only end in failure or death. The pressure to be constantly on was exhausting. Caesar couldn't have private moments of frustration, sadness, or fear because there was always someone watching, always someone ready to interpret his mood as a sign of weakness or divine disfavor. He was performing the role of Julius Caesar 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no breaks and no understudies. The intellectual burden was equally crushing. Caesar was expected to be an expert on everything from military tactics to religious ceremonies, from legal precedents to agricultural policy. He couldn't admit ignorance about any topic because that would undermine his authority. He had to make informed decisions about subjects he knew nothing about while pretending to be completely confident in his choices. The information overload was staggering. Every day brought reports from dozens of provinces, updates on military campaigns, intelligence about political developments, and requests for decisions on hundreds of administrative matters. Caesar had to process all this information, identify the most important issues, and make choices that could affect millions of lives, all while maintaining the appearance of effortless competence. The time management nightmare meant Caesar could never focus on any single issue for very long. He was constantly being pulled in different directions by competing priorities and urgent crises. Every decision he delayed created new problems, but every hasty decision risked catastrophic mistakes. He was playing a game where the rules kept changing and the stakes kept getting higher. The moral compromises were perhaps the most soul-destroying aspect of his position. Caesar had to do things he knew were wrong because the alternative was losing power and probably dying. He had to betray allies, break promises, and sacrifice innocent people for the greater good of maintaining stability. Every moral compromise made the next one easier, creating a gradual erosion of the principles that had originally motivated his quest for power. The relationship with his legacy was another source of torment. Caesar knew that everything he did would be judged by future generations, but he also knew that his enemies would control the narrative if they succeeded in destroying him. He was essentially writing his own obituary while trying to prevent it from being published prematurely. The awareness of mortality was constant and acute. Caesar lived every day knowing that it might be his last, not in the abstract way that everyone faces mortality, but in the immediate, practical sense that specific people were actively planning his death. The famous warning about the Ides of March wasn't just a prophecy, it was a death threat with a specific date attached. The psychological impact of living with a scheduled assassination must have been unbearable. Most people facing death at least have the comfort of uncertainty about when it will happen. Caesar had to wake up on March 15th, knowing that this was the day his enemies had chosen for his murder. The countdown to his own death was literally marked on the calendar. The final insult was that Caesar couldn't even control the circumstances of his own death. He was going to be murdered by people he had trusted, in a place he considered safe, surrounded by men who owed their careers to his patronage. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a systematic repudiation of everything he had tried to build and everything he represented. The Senate meeting on the Ides of March wasn't just a political gathering, it was a carefully orchestrated execution disguised as a legislative session. Caesar walked into that room knowing he was probably going to die, but also knowing that failing to appear would be interpreted as cowardice and would destroy his reputation even more thoroughly than assassination. The conspirators weren't content with simply killing him. They wanted to humiliate him, to reduce the great Caesar to a bleeding corpse at the foot of Pompey's statue. They wanted his death to be a statement about the price of ambition and the power of traditional Roman values. Caesar's murder was designed to be both an ending and a message. But the cruelest irony of all was that Caesar's death accomplished the opposite of what everyone involved actually wanted. The conspirators thought they were saving the Republic, but they were actually destroying it. Caesar thought he was building something permanent, but his assassination unleashed the chaos that would consume everything he had tried to preserve. The civil wars that followed Caesar's death were far more destructive than anything he had done while alive. The Republic the conspirators died to protect was replaced by an empire that was more autocratic than Caesar's dictatorship had ever been. The freedom they thought they were defending was extinguished more completely than Caesar would ever have dared to attempt. And perhaps most tragically, the reforms Caesar had been trying to implement, debt relief for the poor, land redistribution for veterans, citizenship for provincial allies, were exactly the kinds of changes that might have prevented the Republic's collapse. His enemies killed him for trying to solve the problems that eventually destroyed the system they were trying to protect. The final tragedy is that Caesar's story didn't end with his death. His assassination became the justification for everything that came after. Augustus used Caesar's murder to legitimize his own rise to power. The empire that followed claimed to be avenging Caesar while systematically dismantling everything he had actually stood for. Julius Caesar didn't just die on the Ides of March, he was transformed into a symbol, a cautionary tale, a political weapon that others could wield for their own purposes. Even in death, he couldn't escape the burden of being Julius Caesar. His name became a title that would be claimed by tyrants for the next 2,000 years. The man who had tried to save the Roman Republic became the excuse for its complete destruction. The leader who had attempted to reform a broken system became the symbol of why reform was impossible. The general who had conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey was ultimately defeated by the one enemy he could never overcome, the fear and hatred of the people he was trying to serve. That's not just the story of one man's rise and fall. That's the story of how good intentions, brilliant achievements, and genuine attempts at reform can be corrupted by a system that rewards paranoia and punishes trust. Julius Caesar's life wasn't a glorious adventure. It was a prolonged nightmare that ended exactly as everyone knew it would, with blood on the Senate floor and the death of the last hope for Roman freedom. The aftermath of Caesar's death wasn't some clean transition of power where everything returned to normal once the tyrant was gone. It was absolute chaos, and Caesar had to live with the knowledge that his assassination would unleash exactly this kind of devastation. He could see it coming like a storm on the horizon, but he was powerless to prevent it. The conspirators had no plan beyond murder. They thought killing Caesar would magically restore the Republic, like removing a tumor would cure a dying patient. But Caesar wasn't the disease. He was the symptom of a system that had already collapsed under its own contradictions. The senators who stabbed him 23 times weren't saving Rome. They were performing the autopsy on a corpse that had been rotting for decades. Within hours of Caesar's death, Rome erupted into violence. The conspirators barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill while mobs roamed the streets looking for anyone associated with the assassination. Mark Antony seized Caesar's papers and his war chest. Cleopatra fled the city with their son. The careful political balance that had taken decades to construct disintegrated in a single afternoon of bloodshed. But here's what made Caesar's positionally tour so unique-turous. He knew this would happen. He understood that removing him from the equation wouldn't solve Rome's fundamental problems. It would just create a vacuum that would be filled by people far less capable and far more ruthless than he had ever been. Caesar was watching his own assassination destroy the very thing the assassins claimed to be protecting. The irony was suffocating. Caesar had spent his entire career trying to prevent exactly this kind of chaos. His reforms, his public works projects, his expansion of citizenship, his debt relief programs, all of it was designed to address the underlying social and economic tensions that were tearing Rome apart. But every solution he proposed made his enemies more convinced that he was the problem. The grain distributions that fed the urban poor were denounced as populist pandering. The land grants for veterans were attacked as theft from wealthy landowners. The citizenship extensions to Gallic allies were criticised as diluting Roman identity. Caesar couldn't solve Rome's problems without making enemies of the people who benefited from those problems existing in the first place. The Senate wasn't just politically opposed to Caesar's reforms. They were financially invested in maintaining the status quo. The debt relief he proposed would have cost them money. The land redistribution would have reduced their holdings. The expansion of citizenship would have diluted their exclusive political privileges. They weren't fighting for principle. They were fighting for profit. Caesar understood that the Republic was dying from corruption, inequality, and the impossibility of governing a world empire with a city-state political system. But the people with the power to implement necessary changes were exactly the people who benefited most from preventing those changes. He was trapped in a system where the cure was politically impossible because the disease was too profitable for those in charge. The military situation made everything worse. Caesar commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions who had followed him through Gaul and the civil wars. These weren't professional soldiers serving the state. They were personal armies bound to their commander by shared danger, shared victory, and shared plunder. When Caesar died, what happened to all that military power? The legions didn't just disappear when their commander was assassinated. They became available to whoever could pay them, flatter them, or promise them the rewards because Caesar. Mark longer provide Antony inherited nod sum. Of them, Octavian claimed others through his adoption as Caesar's heir. Various governors grabbed Provincialed what they could. The unified military force that had conquered Gaul fragmented into competing factions that would spend the next 2 decades destroying each other. Caesar had to live with the knowledge that his death would unleash these military forces on the Roman world. The same soldiers who had brought peace to Gaul would bring war to Italy. The legions that had expanded Roman civilization would become the instruments of its destruction. His greatest achievement, creating the most effective military machine in ancient history, would become his most dangerous legacy. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Caesar's campaigns had generated enormous wealth for Rome through conquest, tribute, and plunder, but that wealth was distributed through his personal networks of patronage and obligation. When he died, those financial relationships collapsed, taking much of Rome's economy with them. The public works projects ground to a halt. The grain distributions became irregular. The debt relief programs were abandoned. The veterans who had been promised land grants found themselves with worthless pieces of paper instead of productive farms. Caesar's death didn't just kill one man. It destroyed the entire economic ecosystem he had created to keep Rome functioning. But the psychological impact was perhaps the most devastating of all. Caesar had become more than a political leader. He was a symbol of Roman invincibility, proof that Rome could overcome any challenge and defeat any enemy. His assassination shattered that myth and replaced it with something far more sinister. The knowledge that Romans were willing to murder their own greatest leaders. The message sent by the Ides of March wasn't that tyranny would be punished. It was that success would be rewarded with betrayal. Excellence would be met with assassination. Loyalty would be repaid with conspiracy. The conspirators thought they were defending Roman values, but they were actually destroying the possibility of anyone ever trusting those values again. Future leaders learned the wrong lessons from Caesar's death. Instead of seeing it as a warning against ambition, they saw it as proof that you had to be more ruthless, more paranoid, more willing to strike first before your enemies could organize against you. Augustus didn't become a gentler, more republican leader than Caesar. He became a more effective dictator who was better at hiding his true nature. The republic the conspirators died to protect was replaced by an empire that was everything they had feared Caesar might become. The Principate was monarchy disguised as traditional government, autocracy wrapped in republican rhetoric. Augustus achieved all the power Caesar had supposedly sought, but he was clever enough to make it look like he was reluctantly accepting authority rather than eagerly grasping it. Caesar had to watch all of this unfold in his mind, seeing the future consequences of his present actions, but unable to change course without triggering the very disaster choice trying to prevent. Every he made brought the crisis closer. Every reform proposal generated more opposition. Every success created more fear among his enemies. The relationship with Octavian was another source of torment that Caesar couldn't fully understand until it was too late. He had adopted his great-nephew as his heir, thinking he was providing for a smooth succession that would preserve his reforms and maintain stability. Instead, he was creating the instrument of the Republic's final destruction. Octavian wasn't interested in preserving Caesar's vision of reformed republicanism. He wanted to surpass Caesar's achievements and establish a dynasty that would last for centuries. The young man Caesar had mentored and protected would become Augustus, the first emperor, the founder of a system that would make Caesar's temporary dictatorship look like a brief experiment in limited government. Caesar's letters and personal papers, seized by Mark Antony after the assassination, revealed the depth of his awareness about Rome's problems and his desperation to find solutions. He wasn't some power-hungry demagogue seeking personal glory. He was a deeply thoughtful leader, wrestling with impossible challenges, while surrounded by people who interpreted every attempt at reform as evidence of tyrannical ambition. The correspondence shows Caesar's growing frustration with the Senate's obstructionism, his concern about the growing gap between rich and poor, his awareness that the traditional Roman system was inadequate for governing a Mediterranean empire. He was thinking decades ahead, while his enemies were focused on quarterly political cycles. But Caesar's long-term perspective made him even more dangerous to the established order. The senators could understand and counter immediate political threats. They had no idea how to deal with someone who was trying to restructure Roman society to address fundamental problems they didn't even acknowledge existed. The tragedy was that Caesar's reforms might actually have worked. The expansion of citizenship, the infrastructure projects, the legal reforms, the economic policies, Similar measures had succeeded in other ancient societies facing comparable challenges. But Rome's political culture made implementation impossible because every necessary change threatened someone's traditional privileges. Caesar was essentially trying to perform surgery on a patient, while the patient's family insisted that the disease was actually healthy and the cure was poison. Every attempt to address Rome's problems was reinterpreted as an attack on Roman values. Every solution was denounced as foreign corruption or populist pandering. The religious dimension added another layer of impossible complexity. Caesar wasn't just fighting political opposition, he was battling a worldview that saw change itself as impiety, that interpreted innovation as betrayal of ancestral tradition. The Romans didn't just resist his reforms, they saw them as blasphemous violations of divine order. The gods themselves seemed to be taking sides in political disputes. Every earthquake, eclipse, or unusual weather pattern was interpreted as divine commentary on Caesar's policies. His enemies could claim that the immortal gods opposed his mortal ambitions. Caesar had to argue not just against human opponents, but against the apparent will of heaven itself. The auguries and omens that surrounded Caesar's final months weren't just religious theatre, they were psychological warfare designed to undermine his confidence and legitimacy. The famous soothsayer's warning about the Ides of March was part of a coordinated campaign to make Caesar believe that his own death was inevitable and divinely ordained. Living under that kind of supernatural pressure while trying to govern a collapsing empire must have been psychologically devastating. Caesar had to maintain public confidence in his leadership while privately dealing with prophecies of doom, divine warnings, and religious opposition to his every action. The final months were a countdown to catastrophe that everyone could see coming but no one could prevent. The conspirators were openly meeting and planning. The omens were increasingly ominous. The political situation was deteriorating rapidly. Caesar was trapped in a situation where doing nothing guaranteed disaster, but taking action would trigger the very crisis he was trying to avoid. The Senate meeting on the Ides of March was a perfect symbol of everything wrong with Caesar's situation. He knew it was dangerous to attend, but refusing to appear would have been interpreted as cowardice or tyrannical contempt for republican institutions. He was forced to walk into what he knew was probably his own execution in order to maintain the fiction that he respected the system that was trying to destroy him. The conspirators chose their location carefully. They killed Caesar at the foot of Pompey's statue, symbolically suggesting that his former rival was getting posthumous revenge. They wanted his death to be seen as divine justice rather than political murder. Caesar died surrounded by the symbols of everything he had tried to transcend. The 23 stab wounds weren't just assassination, they were ritual sacrifice, each conspirator taking personal responsibility for the killing to share both the guilt and the glory. Caesar's body became a political statement about the price of ambition and the power of traditional Roman values. His blood was spilled not just to end his life, but to consecrate their cause. But the conspirators' triumph lasted exactly as long as it took for news of the assassination to spread through the city. Within hours, they realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The Roman people didn't celebrate Caesar's death as liberation from tyranny. They mourned it as the loss of their protector and provider. The urban poor, who had benefited from Caesar's grain distributions and public works projects, saw the assassination as an attack on their interests. The veterans, who owed their land grants and bonuses to Caesar's generosity, viewed it as betrayal of their commander. The provinces, which had prospered under Caesar's administration, saw it as the beginning of renewed exploitation by senatorial governors. Mark Antony's funeral oration transformed Caesar from a controversial political figure into a martyred hero. The reading of Caesar's will, which left generous gifts to the Roman people and opened his private gardens for public use, made the contrast between his generosity and his assassin's selfishness impossible to ignore. The conspirators found themselves barricaded on the Capitoline Hill while mobs searched for them in the streets below. Their moment of triumph had become a nightmare of public rejection and personal danger. They had killed Caesar thinking they were saving Rome, but they had actually triggered the very chaos they claimed to be preventing. The irony was that Caesar's ghost proved more powerful than Caesar's living presence had ever been. Dead, he became a symbol that could be manipulated by his successors. Alive, he had been constrained by the need to work within existing institutions and maintain some pretense of republican government. Augustus used Caesar's assassination as the justification for every authoritarian measure he implemented. The civil wars that followed were fought in Caesar's name. The empire that emerged was presented as the fulfillment of Caesar's vision. The dictator who had tried to preserve some version of republican government became the excuse for its complete elimination. Caesar's deification wasn't just religious ceremony, it was political strategy. Making Caesar a god meant that opposing his heir was sacrilege, that questioning his policies was blasphemy, that resistance to his successors was impiety. The man who had struggled with the burden of mortal leadership became an immortal weapon in the hands of those who came after him. The temples built to honour the divine Julius weren't celebrating Caesar's achievements. They were monuments to the failure of republican government and the inevitability of imperial rule. Every sacrifice offered to Caesar's spirit was a reminder that the old system had died with him and that the new order was permanent and divinely sanctioned. The transformation of Caesar from controversial leader to divine ancestor was perhaps the final insult to his memory. The man who had spent his life trying to balance competing interests and preserve some version of Roman freedom became the symbol used to justify absolute monarchy and the permanent suppression of political opposition. Caesar's name became a title, Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar, that would be claimed by autocrats for the next 2 millennia. Every petty dictator and absolute monarch would wrap themselves in his legacy while ignoring everything he had actually tried to accomplish. The reformer who had died trying to save republican government became the eternal symbol of imperial tyranny. That's the ultimate tragedy of Julius Caesar's life. He didn't just fail to achieve his goals. His failure became the excuse for everything he had tried to prevent. His death didn't preserve Roman freedom. It became the reason why Roman freedom had to be permanently suspended. The man who had crossed the Rubicon to save the Republic ended up providing the justification for its complete destruction. And perhaps, in those final moments as the daggers found their mark, Caesar understood the cosmic joke of his situation. He had spent his entire life trying to prevent the very future that his death would make inevitable. The Senate chamber where he died would soon be empty of real power. The republic he had tried to reform would be replaced by an empire that made his dictatorship look like a brief experiment in limited government. The conspirators thought they were writing the end of Caesar's story. Instead, they were writing the beginning of something far worse than anything Caesar had ever contemplated. And Caesar, bleeding out at the foot of Pompey's statue, probably realized that his enemies had just guaranteed that everything he had feared would come to pass. That's not glory. That's not triumph. That's the most perfect definition of tragedy ever written in blood on marble floors. Julius Caesar didn't die as a tyrant. He died as the last man who might have been able to save what the Republic could have become. The physical act of dying itself was probably a relief compared to what came before. 23 stab wounds from 23 different men, each one taking personal responsibility for the killing. But even that final violence was choreographed political theatre. The conspirators weren't just murdering Caesar, they were performing a ritual sacrifice to their vision of Roman virtue. Each blade that pierced his flesh carried the weight of years of resentment, fear, and frustrated ambition. These weren't random assassins hired for coin. These were men Caesar had known personally, had worked with, had promoted. had trusted. Brutus, whom he loved like a son. Cassius, who had served under his command. Senators who had dined at his table and smiled at his jokes. The psychological torture of recognizing each face as the daggers fell must have been worse than the physical pain. Caesar wasn't just being murdered, he was being systematically betrayed by every relationship he had cultivated, every alliance he had built, every friendship he had treasured. His life's work in human connection was being literally stabbed to death in front of his eyes. But even as he died, Caesar had to maintain his dignity. Roman culture demanded that leaders face death with stoic courage. Any cry of pain, any plea for mercy, any display of weakness would have undermined everything he had tried to build. He had to die as Caesar the legend, not Caesar the terrified human being who was watching his world collapse in real time. The location was another calculated insult. They killed him at the foot of Pompey's statue, suggesting that his former rival was getting posthumous revenge. Caesar died staring up at the marble face of the man he had defeated in civil war, surrounded by senators who claimed to be defending the Republic while destroying its last hope for peaceful reform. The irony was suffocating. Caesar had spent decades trying to avoid exactly this kind of violence. His entire political career was built on finding diplomatic solutions to problems that others wanted to resolve through bloodshed. He had pardoned his enemies after the Civil War, incorporated former opponents into his administration, and consistently chosen mercy over vengeance. But mercy was interpreted as weakness. Forgiveness was seen as political calculation rather than genuine magnanimity. Every act of clemency became evidence that Caesar was soft, that he could be pushed, that his enemies could plot against him without serious consequences. His greatest virtues became the weapons used to destroy him. The Senate chamber itself was a perfect metaphor for everything wrong with Caesar's situation. This was supposed to be the heart of Roman democracy, the place where reasoned debate and principled compromise shaped the future of civilization. Instead, it had become an abattoir where political disagreement was resolved through premeditated murder. The building that should have represented the triumph of law over violence, of civilization over barbarism, of reason over passion, had been transformed into a crime scene. The marble floors that had witnessed centuries of oratory and debate were now slick with the blood of the man who had tried hardest to make the system actually work, and the conspirators weren't finished with their theatre. After Caesar fell, they marched through the streets of Rome with their bloody daggers raised, proclaiming that they had liberated the Republic from tyranny. They expected cheers, celebrations, grateful crowds thanking them for their patriotic service. Instead, they found horror, confusion, and growing rage. The Roman people didn't see liberation. They saw chaos. Caesar's death didn't restore their freedom. It destroyed their security. The man who had provided grain distributions, public entertainment, and military victories was gone, replaced by a group of aristocrats whose only plan seemed to be returning to the corrupt oligarchy that had nearly destroyed Rome in the first place. The immediate aftermath was everything Caesar had feared and more. Within hours, Mark Antony had seized Caesar's papers and treasury. Cleopatra fled the city with their son. The careful political balance that had taken decades to construct evaporated in an afternoon of violence. Rome was suddenly rudderless in a world full of enemies who had been held in check only by fear of Caesar's military genius. But the long-term consequences were even worse. The civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination were far more destructive than anything he had done while alive. The Republic the conspirators claimed to be saving was replaced by an empire that eliminated every trace of the democratic traditions they supposedly died to protect. Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, learned all the wrong lessons from his predecessor's fate. Instead of being more respectful of republican institutions, he became more skilled at hiding his autocracy behind constitutional facades. Instead of sharing power more equitably, he concentrated it more effectively. Instead of trusting in the goodwill of the Senate, he systematically neutralized every potential source of opposition. The Principate that emerged from the chaos wasn't a reformed republic. It was a military monarchy disguised as traditional government. Augustus achieved all the power Caesar had supposedly sought, but he was clever enough to make it appear voluntary, temporary, and reluctantly accepted rather than eagerly grasped. The senators who had killed Caesar to preserve their ancient privileges found themselves decorative ornaments in a system that had no real use for their input. The aristocracy that had dominated Roman politics for centuries was reduced to ceremonial roles in an imperial court. The freedom they had died to protect was replaced by the security of absolute rule, and Caesar's name became the ultimate insult to his memory. Every petty tyrant and absolute monarch for the next 2,000 years would claim his legacy while ignoring everything he had actually tried to accomplish. Kaiser, Czar, Caesar. His name became synonymous with the very imperial tyranny he had spent his life trying to prevent. The deification was perhaps the cruelest twist of all. Making Caesar a god wasn't honouring his achievements, it was creating a political weapon that his successors could wield against any opposition. Questioning Augustus meant questioning divine will. Resisting imperial policy meant committing sacrilege. The man who had struggled with very human problems became an immortal excuse for inhuman governance. But maybe the most tragic aspect of Caesar's legacy is how completely his actual vision was forgotten. The reforms he had proposed, debt relief for the poor, land distribution for veterans, expanded citizenship for allies, infrastructure development, legal standardization, were exactly the kinds of changes that might have saved the Republic by addressing its underlying structural problems. Instead of implementing Caesar's solutions, his successors used his martyrdom to justify abandoning the search for solutions entirely. Why fix a broken system when you can replace it with something that serves your interests more directly? Why reform republican institutions when you can simply bypass them with imperial decree? The provinces that had prospered under Caesar's administration were carved up among Augustus's supporters. The legal reforms that might have created more equitable justice were replaced by imperial favoritism. The economic policies that could have reduced inequality were abandoned in favor of systems that concentrated wealth more effectively in fewer hands. Caesar had understood that Rome's problems were systemic, requiring fundamental changes in how the Republic operated. His enemies thought the problems were personal, requiring only the removal of one troublesome individual. Their misdiagnosis guaranteed that the patient would die from the very diseases Caesar had been trying to cure. The urban poor who had loved Caesar for his grain distributions and public works projects found themselves at the mercy of emperors who saw them as potential threats rather than citizens deserving support. The veterans who had followed Caesar through Gaul discovered that imperial loyalty was more conditional and more dangerous than republican service had ever been. The allies and provincials who had hoped for expanded citizenship under Caesar's vision found themselves subjects of an empire rather than participants in a republic. The very people who might have revitalized Roman civilization by bringing fresh perspectives and new energy were permanently excluded from meaningful political participation. Even the military, which had been Caesar's greatest strength, was transformed into something he would have found alien and disturbing. The legions that had served the Republic, however imperfectly, became the personal armies of emperors. Soldiers who had once fought for Roman values found themselves enforcing imperial whims. The Praetorian Guard, created ostensibly to protect the emperor, became the ultimate symbol of how completely Caesar's vision had been corrupted. These weren't citizen soldiers defending the Republic. They were professional killers whose primary loyalty was to whoever paid them best. They would eventually auction off the imperial throne to the highest bidder, turning even the position of emperor into a commodity. Caesar had believed in the possibility of reform, in the potential for human institutions to adapt and improve. His assassination taught future leaders that reform was impossible, that change was dangerous, that the only choice was between stagnation and destruction. The man who had tried to prove that republics could evolve was used as evidence that republics must die. The intellectual traditions that Caesar had supported, philosophy, literature, historical writing, legal scholarship, survived the transition to empire, but they were gradually hollowed out of any real political content. You could write beautiful poetry as long as it didn't question imperial policy. You could pursue philosophical truth as long as it didn't threaten imperial authority. The vibrant political culture that had produced Caesar, with all its flaws and contradictions, was replaced by a sterile administrative system that prioritized efficiency over engagement, order over innovation, stability over growth. Rome became more powerful but less Roman, more successful but less inspiring. Caesar's personal motto had been, "I came, I saw, I conquered," but his real achievement was more subtle and more important. He had tried to prove that conquest could be followed by integration, that military victory could become the foundation for political inclusion, that empire could serve republican values rather than destroying them. The failure of that vision wasn't just Caesar's tragedy, it was civilization's tragedy. The path not taken after his death led directly to centuries of imperial autocracy, to the gradual decay of civic engagement, to the replacement of citizen soldiers with barbarian mercenaries, to the eventual collapse of the Roman world itself. But perhaps most tragically, Caesar's death established a template for political violence that would echo through history. The idea that assassination could solve political problems, that murder was an acceptable response to disagreement, that personal virtue could justify public brutality. These toxic concepts spread far beyond Rome. Every political assassination since the Ides of March has carried an echo of that original violence. Every conspiracy has justified itself with appeals to the same republican virtues the senators claimed to defend. Every act of political murder has wrapped itself in the same rhetoric of liberation and reform that Brutus used to rationalize his betrayal. Caesar died trying to prove that politics could be about more than power, that leadership could serve something larger than self-interest, that human institutions could be instruments of justice rather than oppression. His assassination became the proof text for everyone who wanted to argue that such idealism was naive, dangerous, and ultimately impossible. The senators who killed him thought they were making a statement about the limits of acceptable ambition. Instead, they were writing the epitaph for the very possibility of ambitious reform within existing institutions. After Caesar, no one would try to change the system from within. They would either accept it as unchangeable or destroy it completely. That's the real tragedy of Julius Caesar's life and death. He wasn't just a great man brought low by jealousy and fear. He was the last representative of a vision of politics that died with him on the Senate floor. The idea that republics could adapt, that institutions could evolve, that power could serve justice, all of that bled out with Caesar's life. What replaced it was something smaller, meaner, and ultimately more fragile. The empire that emerged from the republic's ashes was more efficient than what came before, but it was also more brittle. It could expand and conquer, but it couldn't inspire or renew itself. It could maintain order, but it couldn't maintain the civic virtues that had made Rome great in the first place. Caesar's ghost haunted the empire not because he had been a tyrant, but because he had been the last leader who believed that Rome could be something more than just another imperial power. His death marked the end of Roman exceptionalism and the beginning of Roman decline, even as the legions continued to march and the territories continued to expand. The man who had tried to save the Republic by reforming it became the excuse for abandoning the very idea of reform. The leader who had believed in the possibility of just government became the symbol used to justify unjust rule. The general who had conquered Gaul to serve Roman interests became the patron saint of those who would eventually destroy Rome itself. And in the end, that may be the most perfect definition of tragedy ever written in blood and marble. Julius Caesar didn't fail because he was evil or incompetent or megalomaniacal. He failed because he was trying to do something impossible in a world that had already decided such things couldn't be done. He died not as the enemy of the Republic, but as its last true friend. And Rome never forgave him for showing them what they could have been. The cruelest joke about Caesar's position was that his very success had made him unemployable in normal Roman society. Once you've conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, and ruled an empire, what exactly do you put on your resume? Former dictator seeking entry-level Senate position. The man who had reached the absolute pinnacle of human achievement found himself trapped in a job he couldn't quit and couldn't delegate. Think about the absurdity of Caesar's daily routine. While ordinary Romans worried about paying their debts or avoiding the plague, Caesar had to wake up each morning and decide the fate of entire civilizations before breakfast. Should we invade Britain today? Is that Egyptian grain shipment going to arrive on time? Did someone poison my wine again? These weren't hypothetical problems. They were Tuesday. The administrative burden alone would have crushed most modern CEOs. Caesar was simultaneously managing military campaigns across multiple continents, overseeing construction projects that employed thousands of workers, negotiating trade agreements with dozens of foreign kingdoms, and trying to keep the Roman mob entertained with increasingly expensive spectacles. And he had to do all of this without email, phones, or even reliable maps. Every decision cascaded into a dozen new problems. Approve funding for a new aqueduct, and suddenly you're dealing with construction delays, labour disputes, and senators complaining about the cost. Grant citizenship to Gallic tribes, and now you have Roman purists claiming you're diluting their precious bloodline. Win a brilliant military victory, and your reward is having to manage the logistics of feeding and housing thousands of prisoners of war. The paperwork must have been nightmarish. Ancient bureaucracy was just as soul-crushing as the modern version, except instead of filing quarterly reports, Caesar was processing tribute payments from conquered territories, legal appeals from provincial governors, and requests for everything from bridge repairs to permission to hold local festivals. Imagine trying to run a multinational corporation using nothing but handwritten scrolls and messengers on horseback. But the real psychological torture was the knowledge that none of it mattered in the long run. Caesar could see the structural problems eating away at Roman society like termites in the foundation of a house. The gap between rich and poor was widening into a chasm. The traditional institutions were creaking under the weight of governing an empire they were never designed to handle. The military was becoming more loyal to individual commanders than to the state itself. Caesar understood that these problems required fundamental changes, but every attempt at reform was interpreted as an attack on Roman values. Try to redistribute land to veterans, and you're accused of stealing from honest citizens. Extend citizenship to allies, and you're diluting Roman identity. Provide grain subsidies to the urban poor, and you're bribing the mob. There was literally no policy position that wouldn't generate fierce opposition from someone with money and influence. The Senate meetings were exercises in organised futility. Picture sitting in a room with 60 men who hate you, listening to them give speeches about the good old days when Rome was pure and uncorrupted, knowing that half of them are taking bribes and the other half are embezzling public funds. Every proposal you make is dissected, delayed, and ultimately sabotaged by people whose only qualification for office is having been born into wealthy families. Caesar had to listen to senators lecture him about fiscal responsibility while they voted themselves pay raises. He had to endure speeches about Roman virtue from men who owned vast slave plantations and charged interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. The hypocrisy was so thick you could cut it with a gladius, but Caesar had to sit there nodding respectfully because openly calling them out would have triggered a constitutional crisis. The foreign policy challenges were equally impossible. Rome's enemies weren't going to politely wait while the Senate debated the proper procedures for declaring war. Germanic tribes were raiding across the Rhine. Parthian armies were threatening Roman interests in the east. Pirates were disrupting Mediterranean trade routes. Caesar needed to respond quickly and decisively, but every military action required Senate approval that could take months to obtain, and when Caesar did take initiative to protect Roman interests, he was accused of exceeding his authority. When he waited for proper authorization, he was blamed for allowing enemies to gain strength. It was a perfect catch-22, designed to make effective leadership impossible. The system was rigged to ensure that anyone capable enough to solve Rome's problems would be destroyed by the process of trying to solve them. The economic pressures were relentless and contradictory. Rome needed constant military expansion to fund its operations, but expansion created new administrative burdens and new enemies. The provinces had to be profitable enough to justify the cost of conquest, but if they were too profitable, local governors would use their wealth to fund rebellion against Rome. Caesar was constantly balancing the books on an empire where every asset was also a liability. The currency system was a disaster waiting to happen. Roman coins were worth whatever amount of silver or gold they contained, which meant that successful military campaigns could actually cause inflation by flooding the market with precious metals. Caesar's victories in Gaul brought enormous wealth to Rome, but they also destabilized the entire monetary system. The man who was supposed to be making Rome richer was inadvertently making Roman money worth less. Tax collection was another nightmare. The provinces were squeezed for revenue by publicans who bought the right to collect taxes and then tried to extract as much profit as possible. This system guaranteed corruption, rebellion, and economic inefficiency, but it was also the only way Rome could afford to govern distant territories. Caesar knew it was destroying provincial loyalty, but he couldn't change it without bankrupting the state. The legal system was breaking down under the weight of empire. Roman law was sophisticated but designed for a city-state, not a Mediterranean-spanning empire with dozens of different cultures and legal traditions. Caesar had to make decisions about disputes involving Egyptian property law, Gallic tribal customs, and Greek commercial practices, often without understanding the local context or having access to relevant precedents. Every legal ruling set a precedent that could be used or misused in future cases. Caesar wasn't just deciding individual disputes, he was essentially writing the legal code for half the known world. And he had to do it while also managing military campaigns, political crises, and assassination attempts. Modern Supreme Court justices spend months deliberating on single cases. Caesar was making comparable decisions between breakfast and lunch. The religious obligations were particularly absurd. As Pontifex Maximus, Caesar was responsible for maintaining Rome's relationship with the gods. But Roman religion was a bureaucratic nightmare of competing cults, conflicting traditions, and political manipulation. Every religious ceremony was also a political statement. Every sacrifice could be interpreted as either pious devotion or manipulative theatre. The augurs and haruspices weren't just religious figures. They were political operators who could influence public opinion by claiming divine approval or disapproval of Caesar's policies. A flock of birds flying in the wrong direction could derail a military campaign. An unexpected thunderstorm could be interpreted as proof that the gods opposed a particular law. Caesar had to navigate not just human politics but divine politics, never knowing which priest was genuinely interpreting omens and which one was getting paid by his enemies. The calendar itself was a source of constant frustration. The Roman calendar was so badly designed that it had drifted completely out of sync with the seasons. Religious celebrated in the wrong months. Festivals were being agricultural activities were scheduled at inappropriate times. Military campaigns were being planned based on dates that no longer corresponded to actual weather patterns. Caesar eventually fixed this problem by implementing the Julian calendar, but even that reform generated opposition from traditionalists who claimed he was offending the gods by changing sacred timekeeping. Personal relationships were impossible to maintain. Every friendship was potentially a political alliance. Every romantic relationship carried diplomatic implications. Every family gathering was an opportunity for relatives to ask for favors, positions, or protection from their enemies. Caesar couldn't have normal human connections because nothing in his life was normal or human anymore. His relationship with his daughter Julia had been both personally meaningful and politically crucial. Her marriage to Pompey had helped cement the first triumvirate, but it also meant that Caesar's most important family relationship was essentially a diplomatic treaty. When Julia died in childbirth, Caesar lost not just a beloved daughter, but also a key political alliance. Even grief was a strategic liability that his enemies could exploit. The servants and staff surrounding Caesar were another source of constant anxiety. Every cook could be a poisoner, every secretary could be a spy, every bodyguard could be an assassin. Caesar had to trust people with his life, while assuming that some of them were actively plotting his death. The paranoia required for survival was psychologically devastating, but the alternative was being murdered by someone you trusted. Even his legendary clemency became a weapon his enemies used against him. Every time Caesar pardoned a defeated opponent, he was praised for his magnanimity and criticized for his weakness. The same act could be interpreted as either divine mercy or political calculation, depending on who was doing the interpreting. Caesar's greatest virtues were constantly being reframed as evidence of his unfitness to rule. The isolation was suffocating. Caesar was surrounded by people constantly, but he couldn't trust any of them completely. Every conversation was potentially being recorded for future use against him. Every moment of relaxation was an opportunity for enemies to strike. Every display of human emotion was a sign of weakness that could be exploited. He was the most powerful man in the world and the loneliest person in Rome. The travel required by his position was exhausting in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Caesar spent years moving between military camps, provincial capitals, and Rome itself, always accompanied by massive entourages that required constant management. Every journey was a logistical nightmare involving hundreds of people, thousands of animals, and tons of supplies. Ancient roads were primitive by modern standards. What Romans proudly called highways were often little more than dirt tracks that turned into muddy disasters whenever it rained. Bridges were rare and frequently unreliable. River crossings could take days and sometimes required building temporary structures. Caesar was constantly dealing with broken wagon wheels, lame horses, sick soldiers, and weather delays that could derail carefully planned military campaigns. The communication system was hopelessly inadequate for governing an empire. Messages between Rome and distant provinces took weeks or months to deliver, assuming they arrived at all. Caesar would make decisions based on information that was already obsolete by the time he received it. Meanwhile, his enemies in Rome were spreading rumours and building opposition based on their own incomplete understanding of events happening hundreds of miles away. This communication lag created a permanent state of crisis management. Caesar never knew what disaster might be brewing while he was fighting in Gaul, and the Romans never knew whether their armies were winning glorious victories or suffering catastrophic defeats. The information vacuum was filled with speculation, rumour, and deliberate misinformation spread by people with their own political agendas. The military logistics were staggering. Caesar wasn't just commanding armies. He was managing mobile cities that consumed enormous quantities of food, water, equipment, and medical supplies. Every legion needed to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid, often in hostile territory hundreds of miles from the nearest Roman supply depot. The mathematical complexity of keeping 60,000 men alive and combat-ready while marching through enemy territory was mind-boggling. Caesar had to plan for everything from seasonal weather patterns to local dietary customs. Roman soldiers expected their traditional rations, but those ingredients weren't available everywhere. Local food sources had to be identified, negotiated for, or simply confiscated. Water sources had to be tested for safety and secured against enemy poisoning. Medical facilities had to be established and staffed with competent physicians. The engineering challenges were equally daunting. Roman armies didn't just march through terrain, they modified it to suit their needs. Rivers had to be bridged, mountains had to be tunneled, swamps had to be drained, forests had to be cleared. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul required building hundreds of miles of roads, dozens of bridges, and countless fortifications, all while under constant threat of enemy attack. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of Caesar's military career was the knowledge that every victory created new problems. Conquering Gaul brought enormous wealth and glory to Rome, but it also created the need to govern, defend, and integrate millions of new subjects who didn't necessarily want to be Romans. Every successful campaign generated new administrative burdens, new security challenges, and new opportunities for corruption and rebellion. The human cost was staggering and largely invisible to the people celebrating Caesar's triumphs back in Rome. Hundreds of thousands of Gauls died during the conquest. Entire tribes were enslaved or displaced. Ancient cultures were destroyed or forcibly assimilated. Caesar had to live with the knowledge that his military genius was built on a foundation of systematic destruction that would echo through history. The psychological toll of command was something Caesar could never acknowledge publicly. Roman culture demanded that leaders project strength and confidence at all times. Any admission of doubt, guilt, or moral uncertainty would have been seized upon by enemies as evidence of unfitness to rule. Caesar had to carry the weight of every decision, every casualty, every destroyed city in perfect silence. The veteran soldiers who served under Caesar weren't just military assets. They were human beings with families, hopes, and fears. When Caesar ordered a charge that resulted in heavy casualties, he wasn't just making a tactical decision, he was sending men he knew personally to their deaths. The bonds forged in shared combat made these losses deeply personal, but Caesar couldn't allow grief to interfere with the need to make more life-and-death decisions. The political implications of military success were toxic. Every victory made Caesar more popular with the common people and more feared by the Senate. The same achievements that should have secured his position actually made him more vulnerable to assassination. Success wasn't protecting him, it was painting a larger target on his back. Caesar was trapped in a system where excellence was rewarded with elimination. The transition from military commander to political leader required completely different skills, but Caesar never had time to make that transition gradually. He was simultaneously fighting wars in Gaul, managing political crises in Rome, and trying to reform institutions that had been designed by people who never imagined governing an empire. The cognitive load of switching between these different roles while travelling constantly and dodging assassination attempts would have broken most people. And through all of this, Caesar still had to maintain the public persona of the invincible leader who never doubted, never failed, and never showed weakness. The man who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders had to make it look effortless. The leader who was wrestling with impossible decisions had to project absolute certainty. The human being who was being slowly crushed by responsibility had to appear as if he was thriving under pressure. That's not glory. That's not power. That's a prolonged psychological torture session disguised as a career. Julius Caesar didn't live the dream. He lived the nightmare that comes after the dream has already destroyed everyone who dared to achieve it. The Senate chamber where Caesar drew his final breaths became a monument to the impossibility of his position. Every marble column had witnessed decades of his attempts to work within a system that was actively trying to destroy him. Every mosaic on the floor reflected the light of torches that had illuminated countless sessions where Caesar tried to reason with people who had already decided he needed to die. The building itself was a perfect metaphor for the Roman Republic's decay. Beautiful on the surface, crumbling at the foundation. The marble was polished to perfection, but the underlying structure was rotting away. Caesar spent years trying to repair that foundation, while everyone else admired the pretty facade and insisted that nothing was wrong. The senators who gathered there each day weren't legislators in any meaningful sense. They were actors performing in an elaborate theatrical production where the script had been written centuries ago and no one was allowed to improvise. Caesar's crime wasn't that he was a bad actor. It was that he kept trying to rewrite the play to reflect the reality of what Rome had become. The morning of the Ides of March wasn't different from any other day in Caesar's impossible life. He woke up knowing that powerful people wanted him dead. He ate breakfast, wondering if it might be his last. He dressed for a Senate meeting that everyone knew might become his execution. And he did it all while maintaining the facade of confident leadership that Roman society demanded. The walk to the Senate house was probably the longest journey of Caesar's life. Every step took him closer to people who had been planning his murder for months. Every familiar face he passed might belong to someone who would be celebrating his death by sunset. Every greeting and smile was potentially the last human kindness he would ever receive. But Caesar couldn't show fear or hesitation. Roman culture worshipped courage above all other virtues, and any display of weakness would have been used as evidence that the gods had abandoned him. He had to march into what he knew was probably an ambush, while projecting the kind of serene confidence that would have been admirable if it weren't so tragic. The conspirators were waiting for him, like vultures perched on marble pedestals. These weren't strangers or hired killers. They were men Caesar had worked with for years, people whose careers he had advanced, allies who had shared his victories and his wine. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was deeply personal in ways that made the physical wounds almost irrelevant. Brutus, the man Caesar had loved like a son, was holding a dagger and trying to look noble while preparing to commit patricide. The cognitive dissonance must have been staggering for everyone involved. These senators genuinely believed they were saving Rome by murdering the one man who had actually tried to solve Rome's problems. Their self-righteousness made the whole scene even more obscene. The actual assassination was over in minutes, but it represented the culmination of years of systematic betrayal. Every blade that pierced Caesar's flesh carried the weight of every compromise he had made, every enemy he had tried to turn into a friend, every attempt to work within a system that was designed to destroy anyone who threatened the comfortable corruption of the established order. 23 wounds from 23 different conspirators. They wanted to spread the responsibility to make sure that no single person could be blamed for the killing, but they also wanted to make sure that Caesar understood the magnitude of the opposition he faced. This wasn't the work of one disgruntled senator. This was the collective judgment of the Roman establishment. Caesar's last words, if they were actually spoken, weren't a curse or a plea for mercy. They were an expression of heartbreak. Et tu, brute, wasn't just surprise at betrayal. It was the sound of a man's faith in human nature finally breaking under the weight of reality. Caesar had spent his entire career believing that people could be better than they were. His assassination was proof that he had been wrong. The blood that pooled on the Senate floor wasn't just Caesar's life draining away. It was the death of the idea that Rome could reform itself peacefully. The conspirators thought they were performing surgery to remove a cancer, but they were actually slashing the arteries of the only patient who might have survived the operation. The irony was that Caesar's death solved none of the problems that had made his rise necessary in the first place. The gap between rich and poor continued to widen. The military continued to be more loyal to individual commanders than to the state. The provinces continued to be exploited by corrupt governors. The urban masses continued to demand bread and circuses, while the infrastructure crumbled around them. Within hours of the assassination, Rome began tearing itself apart. The conspirators discovered that killing Caesar hadn't magically restored the Republic. It had just created a power vacuum that would be filled by people far more ruthless and far less principled than Caesar had ever been. The civil wars that followed were more destructive than anything Caesar had done while alive. Mark Antony seized Caesar's papers and treasury, immediately positioning himself as the heir to Caesar's legacy and the leader of his faction. Octavian arrived in Rome claiming his inheritance as Caesar's adopted son and began building his own power base. The Senate that had murdered Caesar to preserve its authority found itself irrelevant in a conflict between warlords who had no interest in republican traditions. The funeral was the final insult to Caesar's memory. Mark Antony's oration transformed the controversial dictator into a martyred hero, reading Caesar's will to demonstrate his generosity while displaying his blood-stained toga to inflame the crowd's emotions. The man who had tried to preserve some version of republican government became a symbol used to justify its complete destruction. The mob that had been celebrating Caesar's death in the morning was hunting for his assassins by evening. The conspirators who had expected to be hailed as liberators found themselves barricaded on the Capitoline Hill while angry crowds searched for them in the streets below. Their moment of triumph had become a nightmare of public rejection and personal danger. But the real tragedy wasn't Caesar's death or even the immediate chaos that followed. It was the long-term consequences for Roman civilization and human political development. Caesar's assassination established the precedent that reform was impossible, that change was dangerous, that anyone who tried to fix systemic problems would be destroyed by the system itself. Future leaders learned that it was safer to accept corruption than to challenge it, easier to exploit existing problems than to solve them, more profitable to work within the system's failures than to reform its structure. Caesar's death taught ambitious Romans that virtue was a liability, that idealism was naive, that the only choice was between cynical accommodation and violent revolution. The empire that emerged from the Republic's ashes wasn't a reformed version of Roman government. It was a completely different system that had learned to disguise autocracy as tradition, to present monarchy as republicanism, to make tyranny look like restoration. Augustus achieved all the power Caesar had supposedly sought, but he was clever enough to make it appear reluctant and temporary rather than ambitious and permanent. The senators who had killed Caesar to preserve their ancient privileges found themselves reduced to ceremonial figures in an imperial court. The aristocracy that had dominated Roman politics for centuries became decorative ornaments whose only function was to legitimize a system that had no real use for their input. They had murdered Caesar to save their power and ended up powerless. The provinces that had begun to prosper under Caesar's relatively enlightened administration were carved up among Augustus's supporters like spoils of war. The legal reforms that might have created more equitable justice were replaced by imperial favoritism. The economic policies that could have reduced inequality were abandoned in favor of systems that concentrated wealth more efficiently in imperial hands. Caesar's vision of an inclusive empire where citizenship was earned through loyalty rather than birth was replaced by a rigid hierarchy where status was determined by proximity to imperial power. The military reforms that had made Roman armies more professional and effective were perverted into instruments of internal oppression rather than external defence. The intellectual and cultural flowering that had begun under Caesar's patronage continued under the empire, but it was gradually drained of political content. You could write beautiful poetry as long as it didn't question imperial policy. You could pursue philosophical truth as long as it didn't threaten imperial authority. You could study history as long as you drew the right lessons about the necessity of autocratic rule. The vibrant political culture that had produced Caesar with all its flaws and contradictions, was replaced by a sterile administrative system that prioritized efficiency over engagement, order over innovation, stability over growth. Rome became more powerful but less Roman, more successful but less inspiring, more durable but less dynamic. Caesar's personal motto had been, "I came, I saw, I conquered." But his real achievement was proving that conquest could be followed by integration, that military victory could become the foundation for political inclusion, that empire could serve civilizing purposes rather than merely extractive of that one's. The failure after vision his death lead to centuries directly of imperial decline disguised as imperial success. The deification of Caesar wasn't honouring his memory, it was weaponizing his legacy for political purposes he would have found abhorrent. Making Caesar a god meant that questioning his successors was sacrilege, that resisting imperial policy was impiety, that the very idea of republican government was blasphemous nostalgia for a golden age that had never actually existed. Every temple built to honour the divine Julius was a monument to the death of the political ideals he had actually tried to serve. Every sacrifice offered to his spirit was a reminder that the Republic had died with him, and that its resurrection was both impossible and undesirable. The man who had tried to save Roman freedom became the eternal symbol used to justify its permanent suppression. Caesar's name became a curse disguised as an honour. Every dictator and absolute monarch for the next 2 millennia would wrap themselves in his legacy while ignoring everything he had actually tried to accomplish. Kaiser, Czar, Caesar. His name became synonymous with the very imperial tyranny he had spent his life trying to prevent, or at least civilize. The transformation was so complete that most people today think of Caesar as the archetypal tyrant rather than the last republican who tried to reform the system from within. His reputation was deliberately poisoned by people who used his memory to justify doing everything he had opposed. The man who had pardoned his enemies became the excuse for eliminating all opposition. The leader who had tried to expand citizenship became the symbol of exclusive privilege. So the next time someone tells you that Julius Caesar lived a life of glory and power, remember this. He woke up every morning not knowing if he'd survive the day. He ate every meal wondering if it was poisoned. He trusted people who were sharpening knives behind his back. He carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders while everyone around him plotted his destruction. That's not a life worth envying. That's a nightmare that happened to make history. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the people we think had everything actually had nothing except the crushing burden of trying to save a world that was determined to destroy itself.